A flicker of camera flashes pierced the cool July air, each burst freezing a single moment in time. Beneath the blinding light stood a young woman whose eyes carried both innocence and an unspoken weight. She was dressed simply, yet the world had already decided she was extraordinary. Diana Frances Spencer had been born far from the marble halls of Buckingham Palace. Yet fate had begun charting her course long before she could understand its meaning. Her story began on July 1st, 1961, in the quiet, rolling countryside of Norfolk, England at Park House, an estate leased from the royal family. The Spencers were a noble lineage, their ancestry woven into the tapestry of British aristocracy for centuries. Her father, John Spencer, Viscount Althorp, came from a family deeply rooted in service to the crown. Her mother, Frances Shan Kidd, was striking and strong-willed, but theirs was not a storybook marriage. Behind the manicured gardens and polished silver lay tension and cold silences. Diana's early years were marked by privilege, but also profound emotional upheaval. She was just 6 years old when her parents' marriage collapsed in a bitter divorce, a scandal in the 1960s for an aristocratic family. Her mother left the home, her father gained custody, and young Diana's world fractured. She would later speak of the emotional loneliness of those days, of the longing for stability, and of her shy nature masking a deep need for affection. Educated first at home and then at various boarding schools, Diana struggled academically but excelled in sports and music. She loved ballet, dreamed of becoming a professional dancer, and was happiest when surrounded by children. By her teenage years, she was working as a kindergarten assistant in London, quietly crafting a life outside the aristocratic mold. Yet, her proximity to the royal family, both through bloodlines and geography, meant she was never far from their orbit. In 1977, when she was just 16, Diana first met Charles, Prince of Wales. At the time, he was dating her older sister, Lady Sarah. To Diana, Charles was a distant, almost mythical figure, heir to the throne, burdened with duty and under constant scrutiny. Their meeting was brief, but in the years that followed, the royal family began to take notice of the young woman with the shy smile and aristocratic roots. By the summer of 1980, the relationship between Diana and Charles began to take shape. The media caught wind of their growing closeness, and the British press descended. Diana became the focus of relentless attention. Photographers camped outside her flat. Headlines speculated endlessly, and her private life became public property. For a young woman barely 19, it was overwhelming. Yet, she seemed to possess a quiet resilience, an ability to charm without trying. The monarchy had its own motivations. Charles was in his early 30s, and under immense pressure to marry. His choice had to be a woman of noble blood, Protestant faith, and an untarnished reputation. Diana fit the criteria perfectly. Aristocratic background, youthful innocence, and an image that could soften the royal family's distant public persona. In February 1981, Charles proposed, offering a sapphire and diamond engagement ring that would become one of the most iconic pieces of jewelry in history. Diana accepted, her life instantly shifting from young nursery assistant to future Queen of England. The announcement set off a frenzy unlike anything Britain had seen in decades. She was heralded as a shy D, the fairy tale bride-to-be, a symbol of hope for a monarchy struggling to remain relevant in a rapidly changing world. Yet beneath the glamour and excitement, shadows began to form. Charles's long-standing relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles lingered in the background, a truth whispered among the press, but rarely spoken aloud. Diana, young and inexperienced, stepped into the role with a mix of optimism and uncertainty, unaware of the emotional storms ahead. The wedding on July 29, 1981, was broadcast to over 750 million viewers worldwide. St. Paul's Cathedral echoed with the sound of choirs and the solemn vows of the couple. Diana's ivory silk gown, with its 25-foot train, became the stuff of legend. As she stepped out of the glass carriage, the world gasped at the sight of a young woman who seemed to embody grace, beauty, and the promise of a new era. But behind the smiles and the public displays, a quiet unease was growing. The man she had married seemed distant at times, his affections divided. The palace's rigid traditions weighed heavily, and the scrutiny of the press never relented. Diana, still in her early 20s, found herself navigating not only a marriage but also the cold, unyielding machinery of the British monarchy. Her honeymoon, meant to be a private sanctuary, instead revealed the depth of the emotional distance between them. Letters, photographs, and later Diana's own accounts would make it clear this was not the love story the public believed. And as the fairy tale facade began to crack, the world was about to witness the first signs of a royal union unraveling. The months following the wedding should have been the golden chapter of her life, yet they became a test of endurance. At just 20 years old, Diana and her family, whose traditions were centuries old, whose inner circle was bound by unspoken rules and emotional restraint. The grand palaces, the glittering banquets, and the formality of state occasions had an atmosphere she would later describe as cold and isolating. Her every move was scrutinized by courtiers, press, and the public alike. Inside the palace walls, there were subtle reminders that she was an outsider. Royal protocol dictated nearly every aspect of her life. Where she could go, who she could see, what she could say. Even her relationship with Charles seemed strained, marked by long silences and unspoken tensions. He remained preoccupied, often absorbed in duties or quietly retreating into the company of Camilla Parker Bowles, a connection that, for Diana, became an open wound. The birth of Prince William on June 21st, 1982, brought a moment of pure joy. Diana's warmth as a mother was immediate and genuine. She broke royal tradition by choosing to give birth in a hospital rather than within palace walls. She was determined to raise her sons with affection, accessibility, and a sense of normalcy, something she herself had longed for as a child. William became her anchor, her purpose amid the growing emotional turbulence of her marriage. Her role as Princess of Wales placed her on the world stage. She traveled extensively with Charles, representing Britain abroad, meeting heads of state, and engaging with people from all walks of life. What set her apart was her ability to connect, not through formality, but through touch, eye contact, and sincerity. When she visited hospitals, she held patients' hands. When she met children, she knelt down to their level. Her empathy was disarming in an institution that prized distance. But the relentless attention was suffocating. Tabloid photographers followed her everywhere, capturing everything from her glamorous gowns to her private moments. Every smile, every gesture was analyzed, praised, or criticized. Diana learned to mask her feelings for the cameras, yet in private, she battled deep insecurity. Her struggle with bulimia began in these early years, fueled by emotional pain, media scrutiny, and the constant pressure to be perfect. In 1984, the birth of Prince Harry seemed to solidify her place in the royal family. Yet behind closed doors, the gap between her and Charles only widened. Reports of his continued closeness to Camilla became harder to ignore, and their arguments grew more frequent. Diana later revealed that she felt like a third person in her marriage, a truth that eroded trust and intimacy. Publicly, she remained a smiling princess, dazzling in her public appearances, earning admiration wherever she went. Privately, she was wrestling with isolation, betrayal, and a growing sense that the life she had stepped into was not the fairy tale she had been promised. By the late 1980s, Diana began to carve her own path within constraints of royal life. She championed causes that were often considered too controversial for a senior royal. Her decision to shake the hand of an AIDS patient without gloves in 1987 sent shockwaves through the world, but also marked a turning point in public perception of the disease. She visited leprosy patients, walked through minefields, and brought global attention to marginalized communities. Her compassion won her the title, the People's Princess, a name that spoke to her ability to transcend the formality of monarchy. Yet, even as her public influence grew, her private life was unraveling. Both she and Charles were now living largely separate lives, their appearances together often strained and carefully managed for the cameras. By 1992, whispers had turned into headlines. The publication of Andrew Morton's book Diana, her true story, sent shockwaves through Britain. It contained intimate details of her unhappiness, her eating disorder, her suicide attempts, and her deep loneliness. Though she initially denied involvement, it later emerged that she had secretly cooperated, recording hours of tape from Morton in an effort to tell her side of the story. The revelations shattered the public image of a perfect royal marriage. For the first time, the cracks in the monarchy itself were laid bare. In December that same year, Prime Minister John Major announced to Parliament that the Prince and Princess of Wales had officially separated. The world was stunned, but for Diana, it was both a public humiliation and a private liberation. She was no longer bound to walk silently beside Charles, yet her separation placed her in an uncharted position. Still a princess, still a mother to the future king, but now navigating life without the shield of a united royal household. And as the palace braced for the storm of scandal, Diana was preparing to step into a chapter that would redefine not just her life, but the very image of the British monarchy. Freed from the confines of a failing marriage, but still tethered to monarchy, Diana entered the 1990s with a mix of uncertainty and determination. The separation had stripped away the illusion of unity, yet also gave her the freedom to define herself beyond the role of dutiful wife. Her schedule became her own, her causes her choice. No longer bound to appear alongside Charles, she began crafting a public identity rooted in compassion, advocacy, and authenticity. In the years that followed, her humanitarian work expanded in both scope and impact. She visited refugee camps, walked through hospital wards and war zones, and brought the world's attention to landmine victims in places most political leaders never ventured. Her famous visit to Angola in January 1997, where she donned detective gear and walked through an active minefield, was more than a photo opportunity. It was a calculated act of moral leadership that drew international attention to the devastating human cost of landmines. The gesture helped spark momentum for a global ban, cementing her role as a humanitarian force beyond the bounds of royalty. Yet even as her public standing soared, her private life remained the subject of unending scrutiny. Her relationship with the press had become both weapon and wound. She used media attention strategically to spotlight causes, but the tabloids also stalked her relentlessly, intruding into her romantic relationships, friendships, and daily routines. The chase for a glimpse of her, whether stepping out of a car in a gown or walking on a beach, became a global obsession. Her bond with her sons remained the anchor of her life. She fought to give William and Harry as normal a childhood as possible, taking them to amusement parks, fast food restaurants, and charity events far from the rigid confines of royal protocol. In public, she radiated pride in their accomplishments. In private, she instilled values of empathy, humility, and responsibility. She knew they would inherit not only a crown but a spotlight, and she was determined they would face both with humanity. The breakdown of her marriage reached its legal conclusion on August 28, 1996. The divorce settlement left her with a generous financial arrangement, the right to retain her apartment at Kensington Palace, and a continued use of the title Princess of Wales, though she was no longer Her Royal Highness. It was a compromise that reflected her enduring status in the public's heart, even as she was formally removed from the royal inner circle. The year after her divorce became one of her most visible and controversial. Her romance with heart surgeon Hasnat Khan remained largely hidden from the public, though friends described it as one of the most significant relationships of her life. Later, her companionship with Dodi Fayed, son of billionaire Mohammed Al Fayed, placed her once again at the center of a media storm. The two were photographed together on a yacht in the Mediterranean in the summer of 1997, igniting a tabloid frenzy. The attention was suffocating, yet Diana appeared radiant in public, seemingly at peace with her post-royal identity. She had begun to embrace the idea of life beyond the palace gates, more independent, more purposeful, and, in many ways, more powerful. But the paparazzi's obsession was growing increasingly aggressive. High-speed chases, crowds blocking her path, and long-lens cameras intruding on every private moment became a daily reality. By late August 1997, she was in Paris with Dodi Fayed after a brief holiday in the south of France. The Ritz Hotel, owned by Dodi's father, provided temporary refuge from the press, but even there, photographers waited outside in swarms. On the night of August 30th, the couple dined at the hotel before planning to return to Dodi's apartment. To avoid the mob of photographers gathered at the front entrance, they decided to leave from the rear, accompanied by driver Henri Paul and bodyguard Trevor Rees-Jones. As they stepped into the waiting black Mercedes-Benz, flashes erupted in the night, a final volley of light chasing them into the Paris streets. The car pulled away, accelerating into the city. Behind them, a swarm of motorbikes followed, engines roaring, cameras poised. Inside the vehicle, the tension was palpable. What began as yet another escape from the lenses soon spiraled into something far more dangerous. The Mercedes surged through the Paris night, its headlights slicing through the dimly lit streets as the driver tried to shake the swarm of pursuing photographers. The hum of the engine rose into a strained roar, each turn sharper, each stretch of road faster. The air inside the car was thick with urgency. In the back seat, Diana sat beside Dodie, the flashes still burning in her eyes, the chaos outside pressing in. Just after midnight, they entered the Ponte El Alma tunnel. What happened in those next few seconds would be dissected for decades. An impact, a scream, a shattering of glass and steel. The car struck the 13th pillar inside the tunnel at high speed. The sound was deafening, a single violent moment that silenced the chase. In the immediate aftermath, confusion reigned. Passers-by rushed to the wreck, some trying to help, others still taking photographs. The first responders arrived within minutes. Dodie Fayed and driver Henri Paul were pronounced dead at the scene. Trevor Rees-Jones, a bodyguard, was critically injured but alive. Diana was found in the back seat, gravely wounded yet still conscious. Firefighters and medics worked frantically to stabilize her, their movements urgent but careful. She was rushed to the Petit-Salpêtrière hospital, where surgeons battled for hours to save her life. At 4 a.m. on August 31st, 1997, Diana, Princess of Wales, was pronounced dead. She was just 36 years old. News of her passing spread with devastating speed. In London, the early morning silence was broken by gasps, tears, and the ringing of telephones. Around the world, people awoke to headlines that seemed impossible, unbearable. The public grief was unlike anything Britain had ever witnessed. Crowds gathered outside Kensington Palace, their numbers swelling by the hour. Bouquets, letters, candles, and personal mementos began to blanket the palace gates until they formed a wall of color and mourning. Strangers embraced in the streets, their sorrow united by the loss of a woman they had never met but felt they knew. The monarchy itself was thrust into crisis. The Queen, adhering to tradition, initially remained at Balmoral with William and Harry, shielding them from the storm of public attention. Yet the nation demanded a visible expression of grief from its sovereign. The criticism was sharp and immediate. How could a royal family remain silent in the face of such loss? Under mounting pressure, Queen Elizabeth II returned to London and addressed the nation in a rare live broadcast, paying tribute to Diana's extraordinary and gifted human being and acknowledging the deep sorrow that had gripped the country. The Union flag over Buckingham Palace flew at half-mast for the first time in history. Diana's funeral on September 6, 1997, drew an audience of over 2.5 billion people worldwide. The sight of her coffin, draped in the royal standard, moving slowly through the streets of London was etched into collective memory. Behind it walked her sons, William, 15, and Harry, 12, shoulders hunched, faces set in grief, flanked by their father, grandfather, and uncle. The silence of the crowd was profound, broken only by the muffled steps of the procession. Inside Westminster Abbey, voices trembled as tributes were read. Elton John, a close friend, performed a reworked version of Candle in the Wind, its lyrics reshaped to honor Diana's life and legacy. The world listened, many with tears streaming down their faces. When the service ended and the coffin began its final journey to Althorpe, her childhood home, Britain seemed to pause, as though the air itself had grown heavy with farewell. Her death ignited an enduring debate over the role of the media, the pressures of public life, and the human cost of celebrity. Laws would change, and the relationship between the press and public figures would be scrutinized as never before. For the monarchy, Diana's life and death became a catalyst for change, forcing a centuries-old institution to adapt to a more open, emotionally engaged era. Diana's legacy lives on, not only in her sons, who have carried her humanitarian spirit into their own public work, but also in the countless lives touched by her compassion. She transformed perceptions of what it meant to be royal, bridging the gap between palace and people with a sincerity that could not be manufactured. She stood beside the sick, the stigmatized, and forgotten, and in doing so, she reshaped the world's expectations of leadership, empathy, and grace. And yet, even decades later, her story retains an air of unfinished tragedy, a sense that the light she carried burned too brightly for the life she was given, and that in losing her, the world lost more than a princess. It lost a rare and irreplaceable voice that spoke, without words, to the very heart of humanity.